Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an extended look at the recently released zombie game Dead Island 2 and see how it compares both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the original game Dead Island. Now, before we get started, I do want to point out that due to the violent nature of both games, this video will likely not be able to generate any type of revenue for me. And because I am doing this full time, I was strongly considering skipping over coverage for this one, as there's really no way to truly discuss this game without showing that violence. But after playing through a decent chunk of the story this past week, I found myself having a lot of fun with this game. And I really wanted to share my thoughts as I feel that the developers managed to accomplish something really special here. Especially after the insanely long development and restarts that this project went through. So if you do enjoy this comparison and want to support this channel, please consider becoming a member of my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can find a link to the Patreon directly below in the description. Now, for this analysis, both games are being played on the PC, with the graphics settings cranked up to their highest settings at a native 4K resolution. Dynamic resolution and scaling options have been disabled as well, along with motion blur, film grain, and chromatic aberration when possible. Also, while I do have access to the original release of Dead Island, I did opt to use the more recent Dead Island Definitive Edition version of the game, as this not only provided cleaner textures and performance on modern hardware, but it also is the only currently available version of that game, as the original release of both Dead Island and its direct sequel, Dead Island Riptide, have since been delisted from digital storefronts. But because we'll be speaking more about the general art design and gameplay systems, this shouldn't make too much of a difference. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first taking a look at some of the game's playable characters. Now, in either game, players are actually given the choice of selecting one character from a group of survivors, each with their own unique base stats and signature weapon proficiency. Logan, for example, is a former NFL quarterback, and is therefore an expert at throwing weapons. This means he'll deal more damage when tossing weapons at zombies, and most of his skills and fury abilities revolve around enhancing his throwing abilities further. Sam B, on the other hand, is built more like a tank, with increased health and stamina, and is more skilled with larger, blunt objects like pipes, sticks, hammers, and clubs. Then there's Zion, who is skilled with sharp weapons like knives and swords, and Perna, whose firearm proficiency becomes very useful in the later half of the game when guns become more readily available. As far as the story is concerned, each of these four characters are used interchangeably in the narrative, with their own generic and often overly simplistic voice lines for each NPC interaction, and very little personality outside of their occasional outbursts during combat. In more important story moments, all four characters suddenly appear as if they've been working together the whole time, and you get slightly more sense of what each character is like, but it's otherwise not expanded all that much. Fast forward roughly a decade to the long-awaited sequel, and there's been quite a few changes to how the lead characters are handled. For one, there's now 6 primary characters to choose between, each with greatly expanded dialogue that is used consistently throughout every facet of the game. Characters will comment on mission updates, react to scripted moments, and even have their own unique lines of dialogue when speaking to NPCs, much more than the simple okay or nah from before.
Will you help me?
Let's do it.
Good.
The character skill sets are also designed in a way that don't feel nearly as limiting in regards to weapon types. The differences are instead focused around more passive abilities like base stats and innate skills. Jacob, for example, has a stackable damage boost when performing fast attacks, and benefits from more critical hit damage when his stamina is low. Ryan, on the other hand, gets a boost to the force of his attacks following successful evades, and even recovers health when he knocks a zombie over. It's a much more forgiving system this way, as neither game allows you to swap your characters mid-campaign. So, by only separating the characters by their special perk bonuses, players won't feel compelled to use a single weapon type all throughout the game, allowing for more creativity and freedom. As for the actual visual fidelity of these character models, I have to say that the improvements here are only slight. Sure, the texture maps are higher fidelity, the shader work and shadowing is superior, and the poly counts are higher. But the animation quality of these player models are surprisingly worse than those in the original. They're more stiff, more janky, and sometimes the animations are even weirdly locked at a lower frame rate, which looks especially bad. The animations don't even seem to match the actual first-person animations, which becomes apparent whenever viewing the player's shadow projected on a nearby surface. NPCs, on the other hand, have seen a massive improvement across the board, most notably the zombies. The designs for each of these zombies is phenomenal, and I was impressed to find a pretty wide variety of zombie types within each category, with different body styles, skin tones, and clothing really adding to the immersion. There's also a larger variety of special zombies in the sequel too, with most of the old zombies returning along with new variants and twists on the original designs. The standard walkers and runners, for example, sometimes will be wrapped in barbed wire, which is used to indicate that they're resistant to sharp weapons. Others may run up to the player engulfed in fire, or carry around a discharging battery, indicating that they're resistant to fire and electricity respectively. By doing this, players are forced to think on their feet and change out weapons to deal with each unique threat, enhancing the gameplay experience, while also adding some nice visual variety to the presentation. A lot of the special zombie types return in one way or another too. The imposing Thug, for example, has been reimagined in the sequel as the Crusher, who not only sports increased health and powerful heavy attacks like before, but will now jump in the air and smash down with a powerful AoE attack, knocking players over. The overweight floaters from Dead Island have been replaced with a new version called the Slobber, that have more varied projectile attacks depending on the type encountered. The Screamer from Dead Island Riptide also makes a return, and is even more challenging of a threat, as they can both summon other zombies to the area, while also pushing players back with a powerful sonic blast. The only zombie type that seems to be absent from the sequel are the Rams, which acted as tanky enemies that could only be damaged from behind after players successfully dodged their dash attack. Though with all the variety incorporated into each of the other zombie types, this feels like a fair trade-off. Like with the lead characters, the quality of the zombie model designs has also been ramped up significantly, with higher poly counts, more detail, and some absolutely grotesque gore effects. In the original game, each of these zombies had their own unique points along the body where damage could be applied relative to the weapon used. Slash marks could be made with swords, limbs could be dismembered, and blunt weapons could even be used to break bones, making it impossible for the enemy to use those limbs for future attacks. Dead Island 2 ups the insanity on this system significantly, with even more layers to each limb, allowing for truly disgusting dismemberment. Organs can even be seen within character models when sliced at certain angles, each fully rendered and with their own physics applied. And enemy skulls can be caved in partially with varying degrees of damage. It's an incredibly deep system, and one that you really just have to experience firsthand, as even after 20-some hours of playtime, I was still performing new, absurdly brutal takedowns that I had never seen before. Moving on, let's talk about the environments on offer. In Dead Island 1, players are trapped on a zombie-infested tropical resort on an island called Benoi. This includes a tropical beach, dozens of bungalows, lifeguard stations, maintenance structures, and a massive hotel, surrounded by a large series of fancy pools. It's undoubtedly the highlight of the experience, and is available right from the onset, showing off the game at its absolute best. But this is only a fraction of the full experience. Much later in the game, players will also travel inland to a large city area called Moresby that offers a completely different look and feel, with tall structures, dense streets, and much larger clusters of zombies around every corner. Finally, towards the end of the game, players traverse through a dense jungle environment, with winding roads, rivers, caves, and villages, bulking up the game's variety even further. But Dead Island 2 changes things up quite a bit. Instead of being on an island, as the title would suggest, it actually takes place in a quarantined Los Angeles, where another, much larger scale zombie outbreak has begun. Like the original game, each environment is broken up into their own distinctive section, each with their own look and feel. Only, these sections are much smaller and more numerous in the sequel, with about 10 different zones each representing an iconic section of Los Angeles. This includes a fancy upscale neighborhood in Bel Air and Beverly Hills, a movie production lot called Monarch Studios, Santa Monica Pier, Venice Beach, and of course, Hollywood Boulevard. By breaking up the game into these distinct zones, Dead Island 2 avoids the problem with trying to condense the size of Los Angeles, maintaining a realistic scale to the world that feels authentic to the real-world location. It also allows for an incredible level of detail in each area, with lots of fully explorable interior spaces, absolutely rich with decorative objects and plenty of environmental storytelling. These spaces are also riddled with clever secrets and puzzles, usually involving the game's elemental assets to great effect, which I'll talk about more in a bit. When comparing Dead Island 2's maps to the original game, the biggest difference really is in the overall scale. The first Dead Island only has 3 major areas to explore, separated into separate acts of the story. The locations are all huge, often requiring players to actually jump into a car and drive around, though they're still contained enough to remain focused, with almost all the space being utilized in one way or another. Dead Island 2's maps are all much smaller on average, usually only spanning about 2 to 4 blocks. But these smaller maps feel more densely packed, with things to find and discover around every corner. And by breaking up the story to about 2 to 3 missions per area, the game's pacing also feels more consistent as well, avoiding the dragged out feeling of each mission in Dead Island 1. The texture maps across the board are also much higher quality, with more details and a typically higher resolution. 3D objects like trees, grass, and physics-based materials are also higher fidelity, which is to be expected considering the time of release of either title. Another major improvement offered in the sequel is the game's lighting design. Upon booting up Dead Island 2, I was genuinely surprised by just how great the game's lighting design is. Every single environmental light is baked in, with the time of day occasionally switching as the story dictates. Though Dead Island 2 does make a pretty strong argument in favor of this method, as the set sun positions help showcase the game looking its absolute best at any given moment. The game's color tone, while still slightly exaggerated, has a nice natural look to it, sometimes even looking photorealistic at the right angle. Volumetric light shafts are also used very nicely to accentuate interior spaces, an effect that was in the original game but never really properly utilized. Dead Island 2 also doesn't suffer from the obnoxious amount of bloom and lens flare used in the original game, which more often than not would completely blind the player when viewing the world at certain angles. Objects that occlude the sun also fade more naturally with slower pans, whereas before, these lighting effects would basically just toggle on and off, which is especially noticeable when traversing through forested areas. Dead Island 1 also suffered from a really poor implementation of HDR effects, making exterior areas glow extremely bright before the player stepped outside. Dead Island 2 refines these effects to make them appear more natural, and of course benefits from true HDR implementation when played on a compatible display. The sequel also makes use of some decent dynamic lighting effects too, using the player's flashlight, which exhibits some light bounce lighting when used to illuminate interior areas. And then of course, there's the reflections. Remarkably, the original game, or at least the definitive edition of that original game, makes use of screen space reflections in some instances, but that implementation isn't done very well, resulting in some really bad, warped projections that probably would have been better off represented with only cube maps. Dead Island 2, however, uses much cleaner screen space reflections on its surfaces, which come into play quite often thanks to the ability to create puddles on the ground with interactive jerry cans. I especially love the reflections used here in this interior bowling alley that just look exceptionally clean. Shadows are another area worth mentioning, as the number of objects that cast shadows has been greatly expanded, and the quality of said shadows has improved as well. Even the player that previously did not cast any sort of shadow now cast their own projection into the game world. Though, as I mentioned previously, these shadows don't technically match the first-person models that the player sees, which becomes apparent whenever certain idle animations begin to play. Still, it's an improvement nonetheless, and things like trees, grass, and more intricate surfaces are all given some much needed depth in the sequel thanks to improved ambient occlusion and shadow LODs. Then of course, we have effects, quite possibly one of Dead Island 2's strongest assets. Dead Island 2 makes use of several different elements throughout its game to drive the gameplay. These include fire, water, electricity, and a green caustic substance. All these gameplay elements can be interchanged for interesting effects, and will directly impact zombies in a variety of ways. Fire will predictably light enemies aflame, causing them to take damage over a short time. And if fire is blocking the player's path, then water from any source can be used to put it out, whether it be a sprinkler system, a loose pipe, or even a jerry can, which can be picked up and poured out anywhere the player wants. This water can then be used as a conductor for electricity, causing enemies to be electrocuted more easily. With these building blocks in place, Dead Island 2 regularly combines each of these into interesting environmental puzzles and traps, with oil and acid spills requiring water to clean up. Certain enemy types will even be resistant to these elements, requiring players to constantly swap between their arsenal to find an effective weapon, making for much more engaging combat overall. Dead Island 1 does feature some of these same effects, mainly fire for burning zombies and electricity that would propagate through puddles. But those puddles were always in the same place every time, and there's no way to create your own traps with jerry cans or anything like that. The most you can do is pick up large propane tanks and use them to blow up groups of enemies. But even then, those explosive effects are incredibly underwhelming, with a brief shockwave visible and some subtle fire effects, as opposed to the explosions in Dead Island 2 that are larger and more visually interesting. The surface of level-based water effects are also completely stagnant in the original game, failing to interact with any characters, objects, or the player. But in the sequel, water ripples look fairly decent, and some dynamic objects will realistically float on the surface too. Fire rendering is also much better now than it was before, as the effect spreads more realistically and has higher resolution alpha textures for the animation. I was especially impressed with the amount of particles used in this early scene, with thousands of little embers dotting the screen in a way that just wasn't possible in the old game. Suffice to say, Dead Island 2 is a visually superior title in nearly every sense. So now, let's move on to talking solely about the biggest changes to the gameplay design, starting with the way the combat and weapons are handled. Both Dead Island 1 and 2 are designed very strongly around using melee as the primary form of combat. Players can slash, bash, kick, and stomp using a wide variety of different weapons found either on the ground or in specially marked chests hidden throughout the game. Most of the weapons that can be found are long, blunt objects like sticks, poles, clubs, and pipes, though stronger, sharp weapons like axes and blades can also be found, allowing for deeper cuts into zombies and gruesome dismemberment. Firearms like handguns and rifles are also available in both games, though they appear much sooner in the sequel, as they're now more properly integrated into the combat flow, and can even be customized to fire elemental attacks like electric, fire, or caustic bullets. Dead Island 2 also introduces newer combat abilities as well, like a charged heavy attack that takes longer to wind up but can deal greater damage. This is also accompanied by two new defensive moves, a dodge and a block, either of which can be used to parry an enemy's attack, allowing for a devastating counter. Because both games are designed heavily around an action RPG format, weapons found are all given their own unique stats and power numbers that will scale relative to the player's current XP level. In Dead Island 2, this system has been refined further, thanks to a more extensive weapon customization menu at the weapon benches. Instead of just upgrading a weapon 4 times from its base stats and slapping on a mod like before, players can now spend a considerable amount of in-game cash to level match that weapon, meaning you could theoretically have a weapon from the beginning of the game and keep upgrading it straight through to the credits without it ever feeling ineffective. The weapon mods are also much simpler than before, with more frequent blueprints found in the game world, and a clear indication of what benefit those particular mods serve to the gameplay itself. Before, mods like the electric machete never really felt like they were necessary, however powerful and fun they may have been. But now, these types of mods feel more essential than ever, as they serve as hard counters to the much more varied zombie types. Alongside this are a series of new throwable devices called curveballs that replace the throwable weapons like grenades from before. Unlike those old throwable weapons, curveballs have an infinite amount of uses available to the player, limited only by brief cooldowns. And because players can equip 2 at a time, they have more freedom to experiment and incorporate these into their combat flow as effectively as possible. Meanwhile, the player progression system has also seen a sizable change. In Dead Island 1, players earn XP by completing missions and killing zombies. When they rank up to a new player level, they're then given a single skill point, which can be used in the skill tree menu to unlock new skills or upgrade them. The skill tree is separated into 3 categories: combat, which affects the player's damage and combat abilities; survival, which dictates the overall player's health and recovery; and fury, which is used to enhance that player's specific fury mode attack power. Dead Island 2, however, ditches the old skill tree idea for a new skill card mechanic instead. Under this system, players acquire skill cards by either ranking up, completing a mission, or finding them hidden in the environment. Like with the skill tree, these skill cards are split into their own distinctive categories, including Slayer, Survivor, and Abilities, the latter of which can be used to toggle different combat moves like drop kicks, double leg kicks, ground slams, and even more crazy zombie-like attacks like being able to spit acid. There is a 4th category too, but for the sake of avoiding spoilers, it's best to experience that one firsthand. By building out the progression system this way, players have more freedom to experiment with different player configurations, mixing unique attacks and perks to play to that player's gameplay strengths, rather than forcing the player to use certain weapon types associated with the character that they chose at the beginning. The card designs themselves are a bit confusing to look at, making it difficult at times to sift through for the sake of configuring characters, but there's certainly more than enough variety to please any preferred combat style. Other smaller changes in the game include the removal of those weird door-bashing minigames, the removal of drivable vehicles, a more forgiving stamina meter that only drains for certain actions like heavy attacks, and best of all, far less fetch quest style missions, keeping players out in the zombie-infested field rather than forcing them to run back and forth to some hub area like before. When considering all these gameplay changes, Dead Island 2 feels similar to the original game, but significantly more polished and better realized, highlighting its unique elemental sandbox mechanics to great effect, and making an otherwise standard zombie RPG feel consistently engaging. Finally, let's wrap up with a quick sound comparison. Which of these 2 games do you feel has the better audio quality and design?
This asshole off me! Getting in shape. You over, asshole!
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Dead Island 2 was an unexpected blast. Not only does the game look gorgeous, but the gameplay systems Dambuster Studios came up with all work extremely well together, making this tired genre of game feel consistently fresh and enjoyable. The constant introduction of new enemy types, fresh locations, and more intricate puzzles demonstrates a great understanding of game pacing, whereas the original Dead Island suffered greatly from this exact issue. The overall story is just as bland as before, with a cliché plot that we've seen a billion times over. But the lighthearted nature of it all typically works well, only occasionally held back by some rough dialogue choices. And best of all, the game runs beautifully, with consistently high average frame rates on my rig, even in some of the most visually dense sequences. There was occasionally some network-related desync when playing in co-op, and even some brief stuttering now and again. I even had my entire save deleted after a power outage corrupted the lone autosave file that seems to autosave every 10 seconds. But even after that incredibly frustrating realization, I found myself loving the game even more on a second playthrough, reinforcing the idea that this game's core gameplay loop is just vastly superior to the original game in every way. Whether or not it's better than other zombie games is a completely different question altogether. But what do you guys think? Are you enjoying Dead Island 2? Or do you prefer the original game instead? Let me know in the comment section. Also, if you like this comparison, please consider donating via my Patreon, which I have linked below. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.